you access to the notes from all of the classes we've done in this series. If you would like a paper handout, there are some paper handouts of tonight's notes on the table up there by the door. But those notes are also available in the electronic version. So we are studying and have been for some time now the history of the church, beginning at Pentecost and coming up to the present. And tonight we're going to be looking at the first and second great awakenings. So we're going to be fast forwarding a little bit in history. In the last couple of weeks that we've studied together, we looked at the Reformation, and then we looked at the Catholic response to the Reformation, or the Counter-Reformation, that were primarily in Europe. But last week we began to look at the spread of religion into North and South America as the New World was discovered. We're going to fast forward a couple hundred years here, and we're going to be coming into the first Great Awakening, which takes place in the 1730s and 40s primarily. Now, in the meantime, between sort of the Renaissance and the few years after that, as the New World was being discovered and explored and populated and all of these sorts of things, you have in Europe the period that is generally referred to as the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment was a period of great scientific advancement, great advancement in learning. There's also a very rigorous look at how to properly reason things out. And so you have a lot of philosophy that develops in Europe during the period of the Enlightenment that will come to influence the world. You have, men like René Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz, who are philosophers over on the European continent. Descartes is probably most famous for his argument, "I think, therefore I am." Then over in Great Britain, in the islands, you had some folks who were sort of counter to that rationalist point of view. And you had men like Locke and Berkeley and Hume and Bacon. Locke and Bacon in particular had a strong influence on the thinking of some of our founding fathers in this country, Bacon in particular, and especially on Thomas Jefferson. And you can see the influence of their lines of thinking in documents like the Declaration of Independence and those sorts of things. So you have this enlightenment going on, which, among other things, creates a very scientific, very rational, very rigorous mode of thought that has an influence on the religions that exist at the time. And the First Great Awakening is somewhat a response to that, in the sense that there were those who perceived that the religions of Europe and those that had been brought over to America, particularly the Protestant side of things, not so much the Catholic side of things, but particularly the Protestant side of things, had sort of taken on this mode of very rigid, rational, scientific sort of thought, and had focused more on correct doctrine than devotion to the Lord, devotion to right living individually, things like developing a relationship with God, things of that nature. And there were quite a few people who began to feel that religion was sort of going too far to the extreme of becoming very cranial. You know what I mean there? Very cerebral, very mind-oriented to the sacrifice of the emotional side of religion. And so the First Great Awakening becomes somewhat of a reaction to that, and somewhat of the pendulum swinging back in the other direction. Now, the First Great Awakening really seems to have mainly had its start in England with a pair of brothers named John and Charles Wesley. Now, when I say the names of John and Charles Wesley, what do you probably most likely associate those names with?
The Methodist Church.
The Methodist Church, that's correct. And the Methodist Church developed out of the teachings of John and Charles Wesley, as well as a man by the name of George Whitefield, who was a compatriot of theirs. All three of these were Anglican priests, okay, Anglican Church of England, right? And they were concerned that there wasn't enough emphasis being placed on personal holiness. In other words, it's one thing to make sure that you believe the right doctrine, but they said that there's more to our Christianity than simply agreeing with the correct doctrine, that there also has to be an effect on our individual lives. And the reason they earned the nickname Methodist is because these three men in particular, and a group that followed them, developed a very sort of ritualized method of making sure that they did certain things that contributed to personal holiness, such things as fasting on a regular basis, giving charity to various different people, helping those who were in need, spending time in prayer, and they made it very, very, ritualized is not the word I'm looking for here, but regularized. They would set out a schedule. Make sure that you pray on this day for a certain amount of time. You fast on this day. You abstain from certain things. And so they had a very methodical way of approaching their holiness, and so they got the nickname Methodists. They never intended to separate off from the Anglican Church, and really today, if you ask a lot of Methodists, they would still tell you they're in communion with the Anglican Church. They just are sort of a branch of it, they would say. And so you had these men who were emphasizing personal holiness, but they were also at the same time, and Whitefield in particular, emphasizing the idea of more of an emotional experience, particularly in worship. The Presbyterians, particularly the Scottish Presbyterians, had a very rich tradition of preaching. And that was sort of distinguishable from the Anglican tradition by and large and the Catholic tradition. The homilies or the sermons that were delivered by Catholic priests and Anglican priests tended to be, by comparison, very short, and we might even say kind of tepid. In this, not full-throated and bold. It was more like a kindly suggestion that you ought to do this, that, or the other. Whereas the Presbyterians were known for being fiery in their preaching and bold. And they didn't mind preaching long sermons. And their sermons were often argumentative in the sense of arguing against some doctrine that they took issue with, or arguing in favor of some doctrine that they believed in, or arguing that you ought to do this, that, or the other. And the Wesleys and Whitefield, but Whitefield in particular, sort of adopted this preaching method from the Presbyterians, but he added to it a more theatrical flair. And so at times in his preaching, you would find him impersonating biblical characters, as though he were dramatically acting out a Bible story in the midst of a sermon, or weeping. His appeal was very, very emotional. What he found and what the Wesleys found was that there was an audience that was very receptive to that. And they began very quickly to be preaching to thousands at a time. They would often preach in a church building and then come out of the church building and find several thousand congregated around the steps who couldn't get inside, and so they'd stand on the steps and preach again to the thousands. Out of this, you begin to have the revivals that were pretty commonplace in Scotland among the Scottish Presbyterians. But you begin to see it now in England. Now, remember, historically speaking, the English have kind of looked down their noses at the Scottish, right? The Scottish have been regarded by and large by the English as being somewhat backwoods and uncouth. And so the fact that the Scottish were fiery preachers and had these revival meetings and things of that nature was something that the British sort of thought, well, we're a little bit above that. But then you have the Wesleys and Whitefield, who bring that right into the midst of England, and they have a huge reception. And naturally, it generated some controversy. Because you had those in the old school Anglican church who pushed back and said, wait a minute, this is just emotionalism. These people are just, they're playing on the emotions of the people. They're acting to get a reaction, but they're not emphasizing the things that are important. Of course, the pushback to that was, you're cold and you're dead and you don't have any life in your religion. And so there was this strife between the two. Well, Whitefield and the Wesleys did not remain solely in England. They came over to Georgia and did a lot of missionary work in and around the state of Georgia, which at that time was a colony, right? We haven't had the Revolutionary War yet. We're talking about the 1730s and 40s. Revolutionary War starts in the 1780s, basically. And so, well, 1776, but you've got pre-war American colonies that are being strongly influenced by these Methodists. Now, you got to know a little bit about the playing field in the 13 colonies at this time. Georgia was very strongly influenced by Great Britain. And the Anglican Church was almost the state religion of the colony of Georgia at this time because of that. Yes, ma'am.
Was that about the time that they started saying the monarch in England was the head of the church?
Well, no, that goes back sort of to Henry VIII, but officially to Elizabeth I. So that would have been a couple hundred years before this. Elizabeth I, I think, officially was the one where it came down from Parliament that the monarch of England is the head of the Church of England. Although, in effect, Henry VIII was in his lifetime. Good question. But Georgia was very much allied with England. And there's a whole very interesting study about that part of the South and the English roots that are there. But Anglicanism was very deeply rooted there. And so that's where the Methodists found the most receptive audiences in America, because they were, in background, Anglican. And so it wasn't hard for them to come over here and preach in the Anglican churches in Georgia. The middle colonies, particularly Pennsylvania, but some of the, Pennsylvania, not so much Maryland, Virginia, the middle colonies tended to be more diverse. You would have some Anglicans, had a lot of Presbyterians, had a great number of Quakers, Shakers, Baptists, and various different ones in those middle colonies. The northeastern colonies were very strongly Calvinist. They were the Puritans. Remember, at least that's where the Puritans landed, who came over from England. So you have Massachusetts and Connecticut, those colonies up in there, very strongly influenced by the Puritans, who were very Calvinistic. However, this idea of a revival caught fire. And it was not confined just to the Methodist branch of the Anglican Church. The Presbyterians back in Scotland sort of kindled up a little bit more than what they had already been. And in Ireland. And then that sort of made itself felt in the northeastern states. One particular preacher that you probably all know of, and maybe haven't associated him with the First Great Awakening, is Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was, remember, the northeastern preacher who famously preached the sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." That shouldn't be the only thing he's known for. He preached a lot of sermons. That one he's very famous for. But he was very strongly Calvinistic. But he began to take up this revival mood that was sweeping the land. And he also began to agree with the fact that your religion had to mean more than just mentally agreeing with correct doctrines. It had to influence your lifestyle. And so he begins to talk about conversion. Well, the Wesleys are talking about conversion. The only thing is, it's one thing for an Anglican who were Arminian in their beliefs to talk about conversion. It's another thing altogether for a Calvinist to talk about conversion. Here's what I mean by that. Arminians believe that everyone is capable of being saved. And that when Jesus died, he died to make a salvation available to everyone. And that everyone has free will and may accept or reject the salvation offer of God. Okay. Methodism has been described in its origins as Arminianism on fire. Okay, so they were very strongly Arminian. Calvinism takes the opposite viewpoint. Calvinism, remember, as one of its core tenets teaches that God predestined who would be saved and who would be lost before the beginning of time. And so for an Arminian to talk about conversion, what they're talking about is any one of the people who's ever lived on earth coming to a knowledge and belief in the gospel of Christ and turning to serve God. For a Calvinist to talk about conversion, well, you were going to be saved anyway. You were predestined to be saved. You were always going to be saved because you're one of the elect. All you have done is realize that fact. However, as Jonathan Edwards taught it, when you realize that fact and come to know that fact, it changes the way you behave. And so he preached a sort of conversion reformed doctrine among the churches, particularly in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and had a great following there. So you've got all of this going on, and you have the development of what we come to call evangelicalism. Okay? In fact, the British don't call it the First Great Awakening. The British call it the Evangelical Revival. Because this is really where evangelical Protestant Christianity comes into its own. Now, what in the world does it mean to talk about evangelical Protestant Christianity? Might as well talk about that. There are some core concepts, and trust me, I'm not exhausting the idea of evangelicalism here. I'm just getting you some core doctrines. One is the concept of conversion that becomes very, very prominent in this teaching. Now, think backwards just a moment. Catholics for hundreds and hundreds of years have been baptizing people shortly after birth. Anglicans continued that practice from the Catholic Church when they broke off. So did the Lutherans. So did, by the way, the Calvinists, by and large. In fact, about the only two groups that didn't baptize babies were the Anabaptists, who give rise to your Mennonites and your Amish and some groups like that, and your Baptists, who are Anabaptist in the sense that they baptized again, but they're not Anabaptist in their roots. They're not related to the Mennonites and the Amish and things of that nature. They practiced what they call believers' baptism. They won't believe you. They won't baptize you unless you assent to the fact that Jesus is Christ, right? So you have these two groups over here that are baptizing adults. Everybody else is baptizing babies. Now, why do you baptize a baby? Well, you baptize a baby because you believe in the doctrine of original sin. That is, you believe that that child was born having inherited the sins of their parents all the way back to Adam and Eve. Okay? And therefore that child needs to be baptized for the remission of sins, not that the child committed, but that the child inherited. That's the concept. Well, then you get this idea of conversion. Now, the Catholics and the Anglicans had a practice that they called confirmation, which was when a child who was born and baptized, usually as a baby, comes to a certain age and says, yes, I want to be a Catholic. I want to practice as a Catholic or an Anglican. They would have a confirmation service, which is that person exercising their free will to continue in the tradition. Well, evangelicalism takes that and says, no, there's more to it than just a ritual. There are three things that are involved in this idea of conversion. One is that you are convicted of sin. That is, you recognize I've committed sin. I'm guilty of sin. And I am deserving of punishment for sin. The second is you are converted in the sense that you determine, I don't want to be this way. I want to be saved. And typically they began to teach, particularly in these evangelical circles, that there was a conversion experience or event. And frequently they would describe some sort of a feeling that they experienced, some sort of a, for lack of a better way to put it, a sort of a spiritual ecstasy, where they felt that God saved them individually. Okay? And then you would have what they called consolation. And sometimes that was a separate later event where the Christian comes to understand that God has saved them and they are safe in the arms of God. Okay, so you had this idea of conversion that had these three parts: conviction, conversion, and consolation. That was a big one. Biblicism is the idea that the Bible is very important as a source of authority. Now, that concept varies in its application across the groups that would identify as evangelical. You have some, such as the United Methodist Church here in the United States, that would say, yes, the Bible is important, but so is tradition. You have others who would say the Bible is the only authority. Okay? And you have everything on the spectrum from A to B. Okay? But the idea that the Bible is an incredibly important source of authority is a defining attribute of evangelicalism. This distinguishes it, remember, from the Catholic Church that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, who had point blank declared, number one, the church is the sole interpreter of what Scripture means, and number two, the tradition of the church is independently and equally authoritative as the Scriptures. Meaning, as we pointed out in that class, really they're never going to let their practice contradict the Scripture. They're just going to redefine Scripture to make it fit with their practice. Okay? So you have this sort of flipped on its head, and the idea is the Bible's the authority. Okay? Then you have what we call crucicentrism, which is simply the idea that a central and focal point of the religion is the idea that Jesus died to atone for sins, and that atoning sacrifice of Christ is the center and the hub of everything that we believe in practice. It's the source of salvation for mankind. It's also the motivation to do right and all of those sorts of things. And then you have the idea of evangelism. Okay? They were very, very evangelistic in their teaching. In other words, they were going out looking for people who did not already believe this way to teach them and change their thinking to come into line with this thinking. So these are things that were characteristic of evangelicalism as it begins to develop in the First Great Awakening. Okay? So we have on the screen here, beginning from left to right, we have John Wesley and his brother Charles. One of the things that was notable about the Methodist tradition was that their hymns were very, very beautiful and very beloved. It was sort of a marking point for them, sort of the way the Presbyterians were known for their great fiery preaching. The Methodists were known for their beautiful hymns. And Charles Wesley wrote lots and lots of hymns, a great many of which are in our songbook to this day. And if you get out the songbook and begin to look at who wrote them, you're going to find Charles Wesley's name popping up more than once. He wrote some beautiful old classics. And then you have Whitefield beside him, and then Jonathan Edwards there on the end. All right, this brings us around to the Second Great Awakening, which was about a half a century later. A little more than that. It's right at the turn of the century, going into the early 1800s. Okay? Essentially, you have a second round, if you will, of evangelicalism that moves west. Now let's think about the American history. This is almost uniquely an American event here, but let's think about the American history that happens between the early 1700s and the early 1800s. You have the Revolutionary War. Okay. So Britain is finally expelled. You have the War of 1812 that happens about this time. But in between those two things, you have the Louisiana Purchase. Remember that? Thomas Jefferson bought what amounted to most of the continental United States. And you have a westward migration as these people who had previously been more or less concentrated along the Atlantic seaboard began to cross over the Appalachian Mountains and move into, Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, over in these areas. And as they begin to do that, you then have this Second Great Awakening that takes place, which is essentially an evangelistic push west. And you had several groups that benefited greatly from this and were heavily involved in it. One were the Methodists. The Methodists by now had come to be known as a separate denomination, were not just considered a certain practice among Anglicans, they were actually the Methodist Church. And they had developed, among other things, a group of evangelists they called circuit riders. And the circuit riders did just what their name implies. They rode on horseback a circuit, and they preached from place to place. And this was how they were able to go and preach in many of these sparsely populated and very rural and frontier type regions. So they sent their circuit riders out. Their circuit riders are preaching. Well, what are they preaching? They're not preaching, by and large, what you would see and hear if you were tonight to go and attend a United Methodist Church. And here's what I mean by that. The United Methodist Church of today tends to be more of a high church tradition. In other words, emphasizing the liturgy very much in the way that you might see in an Anglican church or some of the Presbyterian churches, as opposed to the less liturgical, the low church tradition. These Methodists were more of the low church tradition. In other words, they weren't quite so hung up on the ritualized liturgy and things of that nature. They were more interested in devotion, emotion, conversion, these conversion experiences, things of that nature. Okay? So you had very emotional revival meetings that they're holding. They came to be called camp meetings. And the reason they did was because often they were held under brush arbors or big tents or just out in the open, wherever they could gather up a crowd. The Baptists also got in on the act, and they began to send out preachers. One of the big problems or issues that grew up out of the Second Great Awakening was you had a lot of people preaching who had not been ordained as ministers in any of the recognized churches. And so you had a lot of pushback from those who were strongly entrenched in the tradition of the recognized churches. And they said, essentially, you have these ignorant people out here preaching stuff. They don't know what they're talking about, and they're converting a whole lot of people. The pushback was, however, a lot of these ignorant people who were out there preaching were actually simply going to the Bible for what they were preaching. And out of that climate that's developing, where you have Methodists sending their circuit riders, you have Baptists sending their evangelists, you have Presbyterians who are moving west and also being very evangelistic with their fiery preaching. Right in the middle of all that, in Kentucky and in that area, you begin to have a group of camp meetings with a fellow named Barton W. Stone. And you had people coming together and they're saying, wait a minute, why are we Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Anglicans? We don't read about those things in Scripture when we go back to the Bible. And why are we professing these creeds? We talked about those creeds that were published by the evangelical conferences of the Catholic Church and all. Why are we doing that when we don't read about the apostles and the Christians in the New Testament doing that? What if we just threw all of that out and just said, okay, we're just going to go back to the Bible and adopt that as our pattern for teaching and practice? And they began what came to be known as a restoration movement. which is to be contrasted with the Reformation movement. The Reformation movement of Martin Luther and John Calvin and those in Europe in the 1600s was aimed at restoring the Catholic Church back to what they thought it ought to be. The Restoration movement was aimed at, let's throw out all of this man-made doctrine and go back and restore the first century church that we read about in Scripture. Now, as you know, the bell just rang, and I don't have nearly enough time to unpack that, and that's okay because I planned for that for once in my life. We're going to take a deep dive next week into restoration movements in the Americas, and then the week after that, Lord, not next week, next week's Thanksgiving. We'll have a prayer service in the auditorium next week, but the next time we're together, whenever that may be, we're going to take a deep dive into restoration movements, and I think you're going to find that there's not a single restoration movement. There were a whole bunch of them that were popping up, not just here, but in other places as well. But it all happens during this period of time. Now, there's a lot more I wanted to cover tonight, but our time is quickly drawing to a close, so let me urge you to look at the materials that we have available online, and if you have any questions or anything like that, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you so much for your attention.